Okay, so this is like perhaps the last lore video for something like this video I'm working on, Lords of the Desolate. I've just been out cycling and I'm cold, it's like almost winter here. So I wrote some stuff down wrong, but there's some stuff I added here in like a notepad to just sort of like keep track of the ideas. And first of all, that I think that video games are a wonderful way. My face is frozen and I have trouble speaking because I'm like ice cold. So I'm thinking that what I want to talk about is first of all I have added something like the magical system, where something like be good magic and bad magic, and then something like enchantments, that's more something like sorcery and voodoo perhaps, but curses is something like bad magic, or in a sense evil magic, and then there is something like principles, which is something like nice magic or priest or cleric magic, or something like virtuous magic, and then enchantments. So there will be these three major schools or like choices of like what kind of spells are you gonna learn. And then after that, I think that that video games are like a fun way, and like talk about what I feel about the world we live in, and where I feel like you've been talking about how I feel about life, and that I don't think about this nonstop because that would make me depressed. But I think that in a sense we are living in a world and we are surrounded by something like nihilism, a vast cosmos that's full of something like forces and energies that perhaps aren't friendly to life or people, and something like death and perhaps something like ignorance or something like that is constantly trying to like force itself, and like you say entropy is constantly trying to destroy the planet, but also something like the things that we live for and we build and stuff like that, and then perhaps the soul, and we're like constantly fighting to something like stay alive, like something like I don't know, but it's a struggle in a sense in various ways to like stay alive. And that sense that metaphysical perspective, like what are we actually surrounded with? There's the tangible stuff. There's like there's the table. There's me, and then there's all like my immediate surroundings and what I can like see and so like write down in a journal, or like make a sketch of and draw, and some like perception perhaps. That there is that. But what about the metaphysical? I get that I can like see that there's the moon and there's the basic surroundings and stuff around me and the stars and clouds and all kinds of stuff, and the planet that I walk on. That's the tangible, or something like more primitive physical world we live in. But the metaphysical world is more something like the ideas and principles and somehow vast realities, something like we are surrounded by. And I'd say that we are surrounded by death and nihilism and cults and madness and something like anguish. And that's the world, or something like what's bearing down on the earth and like every single soul and like life itself on this earth. So then, of course, to not feel depressed, I'd go for a walk, or I'd talk to some friends, or I'd do something. I don't think about this nonstop, but I think that this is something like the world we live in, right? And then in a sense making a video game about that, and like trying to like create a world, or like a fictional setting, something like Dark Souls, a very harsh and something like doomed, so like world, a setting where there's very difficult bosses, monsters, and the wrong things is taken over and people are dying and there's like suffering and so on. To try and create something like that world is a way of like talking in a video game about, well, how do I perceive the world, and like since using art to talk about it instead of like describing it now. And that's sort of like these very difficult Dark Souls video game feels like the basic existence we're all living in. Then it's all like what are my thoughts? If I want to, I can make some art and talk about what are my thoughts and my perspectives, and how do I feel, but my thoughts, and you say my wisdom, or how do I something like think, like when I go through daily life and but every day, and like some like what am I actually thinking, and then something like you could say also towns, culture, and and politics, for instance. Like, what do I think about that? And I think sum total, that's also somehow caught in these vast or some like destructive cosmic forces, and we're surrounded by death and nihilism and so on, and ignorance that's constantly trying to like tear things apart, perhaps is the word. And then finally, it's like how you could say does it feel to be alive on the earth? Like that's another thing that some to like talk about, like how do I feel about being alive, you know, and somehow try to like build that into something like a video game, and then other people can agree or disagree and pay for it, not give a shit, and get angry and like whatever, who cares, and so on. But then like have that conversation. Well, what do you think about the world, and what are your ideas, and what perhaps matters to you, and so on. And that's sort of like the idea of this video game that I think is like rather cool. And then I just like quickly wanted to talk about the magic system, and and the last thing is I'm not I want to like, you know, this world I've already created something like the 8 bosses, and this in a sense concept art in the last video. Something like this is like the bosses or something like early designs and ideas for like the bosses and perhaps the looks in something like the video game. And I explained these like in a previous video, so it doesn't matter. But and then like how do I make a world? And it's sort of like the same way that in Resident Evil, Silent Hill, there's this sort of like I want to create this evil world where the lords of the desolate, or these forces and this sort of like chaos and entropy we're living in, has taken over. And the first thing is something like so I want to talk about the decay of souls and most decisions into the lords of the desolate. Like, how does it look like? What happens on people on the inside? What happens to the world? Something like gold, wealth, or materialism. Materialism has taken over. So people has taken over the living, right? Taken over the citizens, right? So the first thing is that when this sort of like you're walking around in a normal world, and then you don't see that, but then you have like a lamp or some sort of like lens, or you go into something like the world where you can like see these dark forces, and when people surrender to them, one of the things that happens is that that somehow that goal, and people start caring too much about wealth and money and stuff, right? And that's when the lords of the desolate start taking over, or something like that nihilism or death starts taking people also from the inside, right? And then slime or something like toxicity, and in a sense things are turning into evil goo somehow. That in a sense the world is decaying or something like that. Then after that, there should be something like fire that sort of reminds of perdition, or burning walls, burning fortresses, and in a sense in walls of inferno, you can call it, right? So this is just art. This is more like how when you go in the normal world, and then you like the video game switches from you're just walking around in the normal world in the video game to something like, then you can like see the world of the lords of the desolate around you somehow. and then I also want something like, I'm not sure, but decadence, I think, where it's something like you could say or too much cursed vanity, too rot of the soul, too rot rot the souls, I guess. But it's something like when decadence is really nasty, and then finally something like evil Satanism and something similar to pagans, right? Paganism, I guess you can call it. So in a sense, the way that there's not gonna be upside down crosses and pentagrams and so like very anti-Christian stuff, but something like that, and that has sort of like taken over, and the Lords of the Desolate are in a sense behind that or thrive on that, or somehow it's turned into their world, and you're just trying to survive in it. And that's something like the basic idea for the video game. And I want to like think about it, but the entire purpose is to just sort of like ask the question, well, what are the something like Lords of the Desolate? What do they want? What could that be? And then to create something like Dark Souls. And I also talked about yesterday how I like created a map, and the idea is that this map will have something like, there will be something like 3 overlapping worlds, where you walk down the road and suddenly Demon World takes over, and it just turns into something like Demon World. And then later something like it shifts again and something like Nihilism World takes over, where it's this vast cursed emptiness instead of something like a type of hell you're in. So there's the normal world, then there's Demon World, and then there's Nihilism World, and you'll have to like fight the bosses in all 3. So that's sort of like what I think could be rather cool. And then there's these extra sort of like places here that are somehow connected to the real world and then not, where you somehow teleport there and you have to move through something like, I don't know, but churches and temples and weird portals perhaps to somehow go there. And what's happened here on this extra, this is like material, the big map is just sort of like something like the material world where you can walk around, and then there's also Demon World and Nihilism World. But this is more something like, perhaps this is real stuff, it's something like a dream world, or you're walking around in something like a partial existence, and perhaps the rules are different there and it's not so safe there, but you have to go there to get something, or perhaps defeat a few of the bosses also. so that's sort of like sum total the idea of this stuff. So why create this? And it's because, why start this way? It's because I know once I have, for instance, the lore and a good idea of both the bosses and the final confrontations in the video game, that will somehow say it all, or in a sense sell the story. Then I will also, now I also have like a map, and it's a matter of start placing these things, and then technically just building this stuff. That now I have a limited and finite project with something like ideas I understand, and then that I know how to make in 3D programs, or something like I can learn how to make, and I can see from my idea to the finish line I have what I need to do this. And that's where something like, when you arrive at something like this point, then you can like either say I have what I need to finish it, or then you can start learning the things you need to like get to this point. You're not trying to learn everything. You're not trying to learn everything in game development, every single shader, every type of code, every form of AI, every single type of effect and particle system, and like something. You have some specific goals that you want to get good at, and some specific things you're trying to learn. And that's, in a sense, why it's useful to, in a sense, build the lore, because it ultimately kills scope creep. I know that once I'm done with this map and I'm done with these bosses, then Lords of the Desolate, that story, or what I wanted to tell with that story, is done. And then all the mechanics and all this stuff has to be like added so I can tell that story, and the player feels that they're experiencing that story. But I've gone from something like having vague ideas to having a very precise idea of both the world and the map and so on, and the bosses, and then perhaps also the build-up, or in a sense the horror, or something like traps and ambushes, but something like mood and atmosphere and monsters, and sort of like say half bosses, or what do you call them, something like lesser level bosses and so on the way to that could somehow help tell the story and create this world that so far is something like a map and so on. So in a sense, hammering down what you're gonna like work on is actually very, very useful for something like knowing when you're done, and also what you need. And then somehow for like starting to putting even more stuff together, simple like then the monsters in this region need to look like this. There's some details here that could look like this, and so on and so on and so on. Where this sort of like lore building, and that's why I want to make this video, is actually quite helpful for like first you get a great idea, and then you sort of like you build it, right? You go from, and you know that from start to finish you're working on something cool or something like important, something like really nice idea, so that the lore and the basic story and perhaps world or the setting, or in a sense the world of the video game, or what happens and something like what's supposed to happen in the theater makes sense, sort of like, or it's gonna make sense from start to finish, and then it's sort of like perhaps easier to make it. And then I think where did I write it down? The bosses, where also I have written down something like what the bosses are gonna be called, and so on and so on. And right now I just think it's a really, really cool idea, and I hope to make something in PlayStation 2 quality, perhaps PlayStation 3 if I can do that, and PlayStation 4 could be very cool, but it takes years for one dude. And then that I have these 8 bosses that of course represent this sort of like nihilism and death and anguish, and this sort of like entropy tearing into everything, and civilization and even souls and so on, and people's lives and what people are building and living for, and so on. But then these are simple, like in a sense also the 7 deadly sins. So I'm gonna like try and borrow a bit from that without like going too much into Christianity, because I want it to be fun and a cool video game with a bit of cool lore tagged on from like something like the Catholicism perhaps, or the Vatican, right, you call it, right? And then I think I have some really, really cool names. And then also that in a sense I feel like there's 8 things that are difficult when making video games, or something like game development is something like difficult or tricky. I would say that there's something like sins connected to it, or something like madness, right? A little bit, right? And in a sense, these, for instance, Gilded Madness of the Spirits is just sort of like the process of marketing that I think is very, very difficult and I don't understand. Then there's Pretty Sounds, Song Murderers, to those of perdition, where something like I think it's difficult to make sounds and music and so like to write that myself for like video games. And then there's The Ambassador of the Desolated Republics, is something like politics, when somehow video games become too political, or too much about who's in power and who gets to decide, and what sort of like populations or demographics get to like live or have this and that. And I feel like that's one of the things that also somehow is one of the sins of like making a video game. When people start talking too much or caring too much about that, it somehow makes it more difficult to make video games and perhaps work together, and somehow make sense of what you're supposed to do with like all this art, when people get too political. And that's something I also want to avoid. I see it as some like one of the sins that could like tear into, or like destroy, or somehow destabilize something like people working on a video game. So it's like all the sort of like things that I think could somehow go wrong. Also, for instance, to descend into like the madness of nothing, or degeneracy, but basically something like people can like almost devolve into nothingness, or disappear, or you could say lose too much, or like certain sides of themselves on the way of something like, and fall into something like you could say emptiness, or like a type of void, psychological void, and to try and like capture that in something like a video game, I think could be really, really cool art. And then not talk so much about it, just make some cool bosses, some great fights with bosses, and then have some lore that makes it like what's this is about, so you don't have to totally guess what's happening, and then just to make a really, really cool video game this way. So I think that this is like a great start for like a video game. And what I want to say is that all this lore and so on, first of all, is fun to write, and in this case I want to talk about how I experience the world and metaphysics, you could say, but also just what does it feel like to be alive, and what do I think about the world and towns and other people, and what's sort of like happening in life and in a sense around me. I want to talk about that. And then this lore, even though it isn't important and Christmas the world, somehow helps me go from something like I could make this, I could make that, so I can just throw something together and hope it's gonna sell, to I actually have something to say, and I want to do a little bit more with a video game than just sort of like throw random stuff and effects together and hope people will like throw a ton of money at it, which I think is something like the devil of video games. And people should take art and perhaps themselves much more seriously than that. And also like when making art and video games and code and all the stuff that goes into like making video games. So sum total, I also feel like when this is like done, when it's a really good lore, I will be able to say, I made a video game. It wasn't just a video game, there was a great story and theater and it all made sense. So that the same way that if I go to like a football match and I win like a medal or a trophy, I can like say I won and it was like extra good and I got something like for it. But when I'm done with this video game, I can like put it like down like a trophy and some like say it wasn't just a video game, but it was like a really good video game in like every way I could possibly make it. So I have that feeling when it's done, it was a really good video game that I worked on. And then finally that it's somehow rewarding or more rewarding to work on something cool and that makes sense and perhaps people could learn something from, or just like an excuse to make a really, really cool video game. So so this is sort of like how I like to build a world, so like a cool setting, and then take it from there, and then you go into like game development after that, and then it's rewarding and I can have all these ideas and I can almost imagine I need this and that here and this and that could look cool and I need bosses like this and the animations could be like this, and if I could make the AI like that, then it'd be just right for this video game. And it really helps me go from something like I could just make whatever right now and does it even matter and so on, to something like right now I'm not sure what should add here, but I have so much else defined that I can say probably something like this, and it really helps me push forward and like know what I'm supposed to be doing from like A to B, blah blah blah, until the end of the video game. So that's sort of like where there's quite a few advantages to like working on something like lore, and it's fun to think about. And even if I don't make this video game, I can literally imagine it, and it's almost like I've played it myself. And then finally I can like talk to my friends and like share about it and like create hype and perhaps the earlier stages of like marketing, and like talk about how I like to make video games, what I think is fun. And I'm not so much thinking I will ever finish this, but I'm hoping I can learn something like to make video games and probably fail at making this. So this is like more like, instead of like I'm gonna finish this, I'm gonna make a ton of money, something like I'm a game developer and I'm gonna try and make a video game, and if it goes well, I might finish this, and if it doesn't, so be it. But I'm more into this for like learning, and that's sort of like a success criteria for me, that I just sort of like learn something from trying to make this instead of necessarily finishing it. So there's all kinds of nice things involved in like, but working with this lore that I find makes something like working on video games rewarding, and then ultimately it helps me have something to work towards, or I can try and make this and then learn something from the process if I don't finish this video game. So it's somehow turning it into like a win already where I am, and then I have some stuff I can work on. I can work on drawings, I can work on concept art, I can like make some effects, I can start looking for sounds, I can this and that and so on, and I have like a ton of stuff I can start like working together to like create this now. And somehow that starts with the lore. Now I know what I should be looking for and what could be cool in this world I'm building. So that's all like my advice why something like world building can actually help you. And then you like yeah, and then that's all like that, and then it's like cool and fun, and if I don't finish this, at least I can talk about a cool idea. And then finally, I don't know, for some like marketing and trailers, I can already start to get some ideas and perhaps throw something like that together. For instance, I have this here that looks really cool, but the more ideas and the better ideas I have like of lore, I can start throwing some more stuff together. Then it's in like early work and something like, so like also add to something like the marketing at these early stages, because my ideas and the lore and what will ultimately happen in the video game has already been decided. Now it's something like the steps towards making it, or at least something like trying to make it and then learning something from the process. So that's all like how I'm a game developer. I'm just all like taking it easy. I also have to focus on therapy, and I'm in psychiatry, so I'm living in an institution. So I have to like focus on you know, therapy, and I can't just all like go crazy and so like end up on narcotics and stuff like for the sake of making a video game. But this is something like a devlog for now, and that's all. Thank you. Bye.